All right, well, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in our country, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar's FAQs Collecting Statistics. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs here at the Clery Center, and joining me today is my colleague, Laura Egan. So I want to give a moment for Laura to introduce herself as well.
Thanks so much, Abby. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Abby said, my name is Laura, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the Clery Center. And I know I'm so excited, along with Abby, to share with you some hopefully helpful information on answering some commonly asked questions as it pertains to collecting Clery crime statistics. Thank you for joining us today.
We also have our colleague Amy here with us today, and she's going to be the producer for today's webinar. So she'll work with you if you have any tech-related questions throughout the session. I'm first just going to review a couple of housekeeping items. As always, I know many of you have participated in a lot of our webinars this month. We continue to encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments using the questions tab, and we'll look at an example of what that looks like in just a moment so that you are able to use that effectively. We'll also have times throughout the webinar in which we'll ask you to share your thoughts on certain topic areas, and we will record today's webinar and it will be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast. Before we move into our content, again, we just wanted to highlight a little bit about the work that we do here at the Clery Center. We were founded by Connie and Howard Clery, whose daughter Jeanne was raped and murdered on her own college campus, and they worked for a number of state and national legislation, but what they're best known for is the federal Clery Act, which we know guides colleges and universities, guides their work around campus safety and security, prevention and response, and certainly the policies and procedures that you have in place in relation to campus safety and security. So these Wednesday webinars are really focused on those frequently asked questions that we're seeing in our work. Our mission is to work together with college and university communities to create safer campuses, and the way in which we do that is to try to create opportunities in which we can try to answer questions that we're hearing in the field and give you a space to really connect with the Clery Center and with others and learn from one another. So for the past few years, the Clery Center has used National Campus Safety Awareness Month as an opportunity to respond to some of the key questions and requests that we're hearing in the field by all of you at our trainings. And so we create professional development programs and resources that you can participate in throughout the month, or that you can access through our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website after the fact, because we know that September does not tend to be a slow time for you all. So we'll make sure that not only is this recorded, but our other resources are available as well in case you want to revisit them at a time where maybe you have a little bit more breathing room. We'll talk about some of the free resources we've developed as we discuss certain topics for today's webinar. So if you haven't yet had the opportunity to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking the link in the control panel, and that will ensure that you get access to the recording after this webinar is complete as well. And then just a quick overview of the Clery Act. We're assuming that if you're joining us for this webinar, you have some sort of investment in how this work is being done on your campus, but we also know that people come into these learning spaces at different levels. Maybe you've been working with Clery for quite some time, or maybe you're relatively new to this work. So for the Clery Act, a lot of all of the different efforts that you've put into place throughout the year is captured within your annual security report that I know many of you are finalizing right now, and that is shared with your campus each year. And in that annual security report, there are specific policy statements, cliff notes, summary, so to speak, of overarching policies that guide your campus safety and security work, as well as campus crime statistics for the previous 3 years. We also know that recent amendments to the Clery Act within the Violence Against Women Act really provided additional resources and options for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Some of those new requirements are going to come into play certainly during this webinar, but I'll also remind you that we have an additional free webinar. We have 3 additional free webinars throughout this month, but 2 of the webinars next week are focused on the intersection of Title IX and the Clery Act and prevention and response to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, and your questions there. We also know that the Clery Act is not just something that we do annually and information that we compile for an annual security report, but rather steps that we take every single day to keep our campus community safe. And so some of those ongoing disclosures are emergency notification when there's immediate threat to the health or safety of the campus community, a timely warning if there's a serious or ongoing threat. So one of the Clery Act crimes that we're going to talk about today within Clery geography that's posing a serious or ongoing threat to your campus community. And then a daily crime log for institutions with a campus police or security department. And last but not least, the Department of Education does enforce the Clery Act. And so sometimes we will bring in information in terms of what we've seen in their own program reviews, because we tend to use that as a source of information on where we're seeing common challenges and how we might be able to address them as a part of this conversation. When we talk about some of the key players and resources, just for reference to make sure we're all on the same page, the Department of Education Clery Act compliance team is the enforcement authority for the Clery Act. So they are who evaluates whether or not an institution is in compliance with the Act. WESTAT is a federal contractor that works on behalf of the Department of Education. So when you're submitting your statistics to the Department of Education, or when you're reaching out to the help desk around your own campus safety and security questions, WESTAT is the federal contractor that facilitates those areas. And then in terms of resources, we know we have the Clery Act statute and regulations, so the law itself, the basis for what we're required to do on our campus. But then we have sub-regulatory guidance in the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. So that's a longer document that breaks out Clery Act requirements into specific chapters and gives you additional context as to how the Department of Education interprets certain areas or certain requirements within the Act. And then, as I already mentioned, the Department of Education program review findings can inform our work, because we can see where other institutions have had challenges, where we might have some of those common challenges as well, and use that as an opportunity to really build and grow and identify solutions that might be a good fit for our own campus. I also want to mention at this point that within your control panel, you'll notice that there are some handouts attached. Not only are the slides attached, which I know you received in an email prior to this webinar, but we also have some resources that we'll reference as we go throughout the webinar that might be useful as you're trying to apply new concepts or ideas to your own campus. So just wanted to make sure that we point that out as we're thinking about context here. And then in terms of technology review, we are going to have some chat questions throughout this webinar. So we'd encourage you to use the pane that's highlighted in red on the screen, the questions pane that you'll see in your own control panel, to pose any questions that you have for us and to provide your own insight and information when we pose specific questions to you. We're not going to be utilizing the poll function for this particular webinar, so you won't need to worry about that for now. And then before we dive in, we just wanted to give you a sense of why we're doing Clery Webinar Wednesdays. So one of the things that we were finding as we were working with colleges and universities is that oftentimes there are a number of different questions that are coming up and common themes that we're seeing in our work. So questions that are not only being raised at our Clery Act training throughout the country, but that we're hearing from our collaborative members, you know, the members of our organization that have taken some time to build institutional teams, building compliance or building their efforts around compliance. But then we're also really recognizing that a lot of times these common challenges or these common questions really do have solutions or do have answers, and sometimes it's a matter of knowing where to go to look for them. So we wanted to create a space through these webinars for us to be able to share some of what we're seeing and hearing, some of the common questions we know folks are asking, to give you a space to ask questions. We've been really lucky that the webinars to this point have been really interactive, and folks have really been contributing their own ideas and questions throughout the session. And so we really encourage you to use this space and this time as a time to do that, to help you better understand and utilize existing resources and to ask some of those questions that may have been coming up for you. What we do not plan to use this webinar to do is to walk through every Clery Act definition, because we know that there are a lot of great resources and information out there, including the handbook, which we referenced, that will give you some context to that. So while this webinar is not intended to go through every Clery Act crime definition, we are going to spend a lot of time on some of those areas where we are seeing frequent challenges or frequent concerns, and we will encourage you to put on your Clery hat, so to speak. We know that you have a number of different roles on the campus. You might be using different definitions to frame your work. You might be looking at campus policy definitions. You might be considering your own state definitions. For this webinar, we're really going to challenge you or ask you to consider how can we look at these specific crimes that we're going to talk about through the lens of Clery. We also, through the first 2 webinars that we've done this month like this, we recognized that we needed some additional space and time for questions that were coming up during the session. So we are going to be paying attention to the questions as they come in. We'll try to address as many of them during the content as we possibly can. But we also recognize that you all committed to an hour webinar. So we want to make sure that we get through the core content that we've put within the slides, things that individuals have submitted in advance during the first hour. But then Laura and I will certainly stay on the line even longer if we're continuing to get questions coming in, which we have for some of our past webinars. We can extend past just that minimum hour to try to get as many questions answered as we possibly can. We still may not get to all of them. We know we have hundreds of you on the webinar today. And if that's the case, we'll also make sure that you have our contact information before you leave the webinar today so that you can follow up directly with any questions that might be specific to you. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Laura, and she's going to talk a little bit more about our goals and move on to the content.
Thank you so much, Abby. So as Abby was starting to mention, today we will be generally reviewing Clery geography and the Clery crime categories and how to count Clery crimes in an overall high-level sense, as that is the foundation that we would need to understand the common types of questions that are coming through. And so we'll gloss over those pieces, and then we'll also touch on the hierarchy rule and exceptions to its application. And then the real bulk and meat of our content today is addressing some common concerns that have come through as questions that we are posing throughout the webinar, and we'll be answering those questions through our slides and then also hopefully as they come through from you all as well. So I was joking with Abby as we were preparing for this webinar that this very simple formula here might be my personally considered greatest contribution to NACSAM this year, because I thought it made a lot of sense to create, even though it might seem very oversimplified, and it certainly is a simple formula, but it can be something that people might even forget, or when you are caught up in the nuances of whether or not you are required to count a certain incident within your statistics, you forget the basics or the fundamentals that would put a situation in an area where you would count it in your statistics. So I thought that this formula might be a helpful way to consider this information or to ground our conversation today. And so that is that Clery crimes plus Clery geography that are reported to CSAs, of course, are your Clery statistics. I can't tell you how often both Abby and I, through our TA that we provide or technical assistance that we provide with the Clery Center, get questions about whether or not an incident should be counted within statistics. And while we aren't in a position to offer a formal answer on that, we will always start with, well, was this a Clery crime that took place in Clery geography? And sometimes right off the bat, many of those questions are answered with a simple yes or no, and then you will be able to determine better if you should include that in your statistics. So we offer this just as a helpful reminder that this is really where you are starting when you are determining whether or not incidents should be included within your statistics. So then if we are going to say this is the formula you should start with, we want you to be very clear on what Clery geography is and what Clery crimes are. So if you were fortunate enough to join us for our webinar, we did touch on geography, but as I advance this slide to the next slide, this is just another high-level reminder of, oops, sorry, went ahead too far. Let's go back one slide or two. Presentation here. I just want to get back to this slide on geography. Thank you for your patience. Okay, there we go. And so this is just a high-level overview of Clery geography. And like I was saying, if you were fortunate enough to join us last week for our webinar, these areas in a lot more detail. But as a reminder, when they Clery geography, your on-campus area, core campus, anything that is reasonably contiguous to your core campus, and then that would include any on-campus student housing. Your public property is a subsection of Clery geography that includes any public property immediately adjacent to or within your core campus or your on-campus property. And then your non-campus are any buildings that you own or control that are frequently used by students in support of the institution's educational purposes that are not reasonably contiguous to your on-campus property. So that's a very high level, very brief overview of what we mean when we say Clery geography. And then the second part of that formula is Clery crimes. So one of my favorite parts about this June was this refreshing of the Clery crime categories by the Department of Education to these 4 buckets. So they formally said that they consider all the crimes that are captured under Clery in one of these 4 areas, either criminal offenses, even though all of these things, except for the referrals, could be considered criminal offenses. They are specifying that there are some that they are calling criminal offenses, hate crimes, which would include criminal offenses, plus some other crimes, and we'll touch on that in a moment, that are committed with a bias in a certain one of the bias categories. VAWA offenses, which are the Violence Against Women Act crimes that were included in the VAWA Reauthorization Act, which amended the Clery Act. And then arrests and referrals for disciplinary action when we are talking about liquor law violations, drug law violations, and weapon law violations. And so to break those down in a little bit more detail, what you see on your screen right now are the criminal offenses under the Clery Act. And we, again, won't go into defining each of these, but it is helpful to remember that crimes against persons are counted by the victim, and crimes against not against victims are counted per incident. So that is hopefully a helpful reminder. I don't know if, Abby, you would touch on anything else there in terms of counting.
Yeah, we'll address that later on, but that's kind of a good metric to think about, that when we're thinking about crimes against persons, they're often divided by victim, whereas crimes against property, as we'll see some examples, typically are not. But we'll walk through kind of some of the high-level rules around that a little bit later in the webinar.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Abby. And then if we just move on to the next slide, when we say VAWA offenses, we mean domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, which are now counted as crimes within your Clery statistics and then are also shared within your annual security reports. And then hate crimes, which would be any of the criminal offenses plus the following crimes that are listed on your screen when they are committed with a bias in one of these categories. And with the VAWA amendments to Clery, the bias categories of gender identity and national origin were added. Technically, national origin and ethnicity were separated out into 2 categories. So you want to make sure that you are up to date with all of the bias categories within your annual security report and within your statistics. And then the last category would be arrests for illegal weapons possession, violations of drug laws, and violations of liquor laws, and then referrals for disciplinary action for those same areas when those violations are also violations of state or local law. So I'm sure you are asking, or someone at your institution is asking, okay, that's great, I understand what these Clery statistics are representing, but where do we get this information from? How do we know that these incidents have occurred? And that is a great question. So you would get information around crime reports from reports that come to your campus safety or police department on your campus. And those reports are getting there, hopefully, from campus security authorities, which are individuals on your campus that are required to share information when they become aware of the occurrence of a crime. And you'll see that campus security authorities for individuals that are listed here on your screen, of course, is your campus police department or campus security department. Broader category under CSAs are any officials at an institution that have significant responsibilities, and they provide some examples in that definition. But it is important to remember that CSAs are obligated to share any information that they come to be aware of in regards to a crime to that depository or repository rather on your campus, and that could be your campus police department or campus security department, or it might be something else depending on the size or type of your campus. It might be a human resources office, it might be an EEO office, or it might be something else altogether. But there is usually a named body on your campus that receives all reports of crime, and that is who campus security authorities are directed to report that information to. Additionally, we will be able, institutions are able to collect information from local law enforcement about what Clery crimes occur within Clery geography. But that is a request that institutions must make of local law enforcement. And local law enforcement, unfortunately, as of right now, are not required to provide that information to institutions. It is a requirement placed on the burden of institutions alone right now. And so while that is the case, though, many local law enforcement agencies are familiar with this request, are extremely cooperative and helpful with this request, and work to make sure that they understand exactly what you are looking for as an institution and to provide that information to you so that you can not only respond when it's needed or when it's appropriate, but include that information within your annual security report and within your statistics for your institution.
I'd also just echo for that you're also not held accountable if you are making that good faith effort to collect the statistics, and for whatever reason local law enforcement or the law enforcement for the properties that you own or control that you're collecting information from is not giving you that particular information. You're not held accountable if they are choosing not to provide it. But what you do want to make sure that you're doing is documenting your request and making sure that it is a good faith request, that it's not that we sent a passive letter and didn't do any follow-up and aren't sure whether or not they received the information in the first place. So document the type of outreach that you do to these locations. And I think oftentimes too we'll see institutions find or share different kind of best practices in terms of what's worked for them in building those relationships. So that's always a good opportunity to connect with other campuses and see what has worked for them, particularly if they're in a campus or if they're at a campus that's at a similar jurisdiction and might even be working with some of the same officials.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. That's a great point. So as we move on, we do receive, I'm sorry, I should back up one step. When you see slides like this that have a question in like larger font at the top and then bulleted pieces underneath it, these are some examples of the questions we receive frequently from individuals that intersect with our organization and that we are aware of the Department of Education answering frequently as well. So this is the first one of those slides, so you'll expect that format throughout the rest of the webinar. But this is an example of a question we get frequently. Who is responsible for training campus security authorities? And so while the Department of Education recommends training campus security authorities, the Clery Act does not require it. And there are no specific requirements in either the handbook or in communications from the department on what must be included within a training for campus security authorities. However, the handbook does provide a lot of helpful suggested elements of training for your campus security authorities. And for your reference, you can find that on page 411 in the handbook. And so what that page really offers and speaks to are the pieces that you should consider talking to your CSAs about. So that is also included on this slide under the cover section, and it's kind of just the basics. Why are you required to report? So it's helpful to share some context for what the Clery Act is, where it came from, and why this information is important to share in terms of everybody participating in the community ownership of campus safety and security. And then it's helpful to include what information you would want to share, or you would want CSAs to share rather, which is, and again, if we're going back to that formula of your Clery statistics, our Clery geography, think about what information must you need to know from your CSAs in order to make that determination of whether or not you're going to include an incident within your statistics. And we'll get into that in a little bit greater detail in a couple of slides down, but just think about that lens and framework when you are training your CSAs, explaining to them the context of why you're asking for the information you're asking for. And then just be clear about to whom they should report this information and how quickly. Obviously that answer is as soon as possible. And then how? Is there a form? Is there a phone number to call, do the meeting in person. And again, we're going to touch on a little bit more detailed information around reporting forms in a couple of slides. But then also the point that we included on here too is consider who is delivering this information to your campus security authorities and how are they doing it. So a lot of people can kind of bristle at the idea of being told they quote unquote have to do anything. So we at the Clery Center really encourage an open and transparent conversation as an institution with those that you are asking for their help. It's not so much informing them and telling them what they have to do, but reminding them that everybody is an important part of the community and that you all play a role in ensuring the safety and security of the community. And this is a way they can play a very active and needed role, as opposed to seeing it as an obligation or something that could even be perceived as a burden. So we really encourage you to frame your message in a way that makes your CSAs a part of the solution as opposed to a needed entity that just has to, quote unquote, has to do something. Abby, would you add anything else to that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things, too, that I wanted to interject, because we do have some questions coming in related to what you just covered as well. So the one thing that I wanted to note is within your handouts tab, you'll notice that there is a sample CSA letter. One of the things that we were hearing from institutions is really going back to what is the best way or how can we communicate about this role if we are feeling some resistance from members of the community that are considered to be campus security authorities but maybe don't necessarily understand why they're part of that role. And we know that one of the key reasons is because these individuals are trusted within our campus. They're likely to be the people receiving a report when someone is coming forward. And so one of the things that we tried to craft within that sample letter, I'm sure there are certainly many out there that you can access, but one of the things that we tried to touch on is how can we really connect back to that source, the reason why they're a CSA. It's not just the federal obligation, but it's really the reality that there's someone who's likely to receive information on campus, and we want to make sure that they're best prepared for it. Another question that came in is are RAs, resident advisors, designated as CSAs? So RAs are within the list that the Department of Education provides as examples of campus security authorities on the campus. So it's always useful to really go back and review some of those examples, but also to remember that this is something that's determined by function. So if you do have someone within that function, within that role, where their role on the campus does have significant responsibility for student and campus activities, their title doesn't matter as much as the actual function of their day-to-day abilities or day-to-day work. The other thing that I'll say is we have a couple of questions that are coming in that are really specific to geography. Our webinar focus on geography was last week, but some of the questions that are coming in were addressed during the geography webinar. So I just wanted to remind you all that these webinars are recorded and they are available on our YouTube page, and we share them on the National Campus Safety Awareness Month page. So please do feel free to go back, listen to that recording, and if you still have geography questions, to reach out to us. But we want to make sure that we're keeping the questions focused to the topic for this particular webinar so that we can get through as many as possible. But please to revisit that webinar, and some of the questions that I'm seeing coming in related to geography were specifically addressed last week.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. I really appreciate that. And I think it's just a little delay in advancing that slide, so I think it'll come through in a second. Thank you for being patient with some technical difficulties. Just trying to advance to the next. There we are. So I'm sure I can go to the next one, but we are supposed to be on this slide of, yep, there we go, of how should CSAs share crime reports. So sorry about that. I'm going to go back to that first slide. There's just a slight delay on the receiving of the so sorry about that. But yeah, we are technically on slide, how should CSAs share crime reports? Great. And so what we would want to talk about here, and again, this is something that could be covered within a training that you were talking to them about, but you really want to consider the information that you are requesting of them and making sure you're being clear with your CSAs about why you're asking for that information. Certainly what you might want to consider here, and we'll get to it more in this next slide, but is the overlap of certain roles on your campus, as many individuals might be named as CSAs and responsible employees. We'll talk a little bit more about responsible employees on the next slide, so I'm going to hold answering anything about responsible employees until that slide. But basically, in terms of that reporting form, you want to make sure that it's a clear form for CSAs to complete. And does it ask the questions that, again, you would need information on in order to be able to determine if an incident is going to be included within your Clery crime statistics or not? So is it asking when this was reported, the date of the date that it was reported? Is it asking information about the nature of the crime? Is it asking about specifically where the crime took place? And is it also asking if this individual had reported this information to anybody else on the campus already? And that type of information would be super helpful for assisting with determining anything around double counting, particularly as it comes to Title IX crimes versus Clery Act crimes. And then we just tried to be a little light here with the Google is your friend, but there are many, many examples of institutional CSA reporting forms that you can find through any simple Google search. So use that as a way to compare and contrast what you're currently using against peer institutions, especially when you are trying to maybe refresh or revisit that reporting form, or I know many schools are moving to online forms. So anything around looking at what peer institutions are doing to hopefully inform what you are developing on your campus. And so now this next question, so going back to responsible employees versus CSAs. So the thing that we always like to reinforce about responsible employees are while they might be a much broader swath of individuals on your campus, so truly, anybody by definition of Title IX's sub-regulatory guidance, anybody could be considered a responsible employee. Many institutions do name many individuals responsible employees on their campus, and the only folks that you would maybe not be considering responsible employees in some instances could be faculty, but many institutions are even calling for those individuals to be considered responsible employees as well. So while that is a much broader group than who are considered CSAs, they are responsible for reporting on a much narrower focus of information. So this question of, as a responsible employee, when I'm aware of a Title IX violation, do I also report for Clery? So that can be yes and no, because not every Clery crime is a Title IX violation, and not every Title IX violation is a Clery crime. The answer to that might depend more on your institution's process for reporting. So if you would report a Title IX violation just to your Title IX coordinator, that would be really helpful, because your Title IX coordinator is also a CSA. So that role is so crucial in bridging the systems of Clery reporting and Title IX reporting on your campus. So that individual is really somebody that should be understanding and can be helpful about what is considered a Clery crime and what could be considered a Title IX crime, or Title IX violation rather. And so when you're considering whether or not you need to report in two places, you should familiarize yourself with what that process is, and if you are an institutional representative that does train on how to report for these areas, you should be very clear about saying, if you are both a CSA and a responsible employee, reporting to the Title IX coordinator should be enough, but maybe it's not as helpful or as clear at your institution, so maybe you would ask that they do also report to campus security or your campus police department. Certainly it is the systems that we recommend or that we see as being best practices of systems do have bridges between Clery and Title IX, but you'd really want to revisit if you maybe would have to report twice to ensure that everybody that is supposed to know knows. I would say many institutions would probably prefer that individuals do not have to report more than once in order to prevent occurrences of double counting of crimes. But again, without knowing your campus process, it's hard to make a determination of what you should specifically do. So really it goes back to, how are you training CSAs and responsible employees? How are you communicating about what is required to report and where you need to report it? And I also say this a lot to Abby, I think it's really helpful to make sure that you are clear about the hours where you can report to certain individuals. Because while it might always be the case that you should report to your Title IX coordinator, if your Title IX coordinator does not work 24/7, which I'm sure they don't, then you would want to know who to report to off hours, and who you would report to when that Title IX coordinator is maybe not in the office. Are there deputy Title IX coordinators? Is there somebody within public safety specifically designated for reports of this nature, etc.? Okay, great.
All right. So again, we want to thank you for your flexibility and patience with our technology. Laura and I are working from 2 separate locations, so it's something that we see frequently when working with Clery. How do we make sure that if you are in 2 different offices or 2 different departments, that we are finding solutions that work for everyone? So we apologize if the technical glitches are presenting a challenge today, but I'm sure we will certainly work through them. Just wanted to address some of the questions that are coming in relation to some of the things that Laura mentioned. One was just asking for clarification as to whether those crime statistics are within our annual security report. So the answer to that is yes, your annual security report does include crime statistics for the previous 3 years for all of those Clery Act crimes, but then they are also separately submitted to the Department of Education. The timelines are a little bit different, even though they're around the same time frame. So your annual security report must be shared with your campus community. That report goes to all current students and employees, as well as prospective students and employees throughout the year. But then the submission to the Department of Education is a little bit later. I don't know the exact date for this year, but your institutions receive an email with establishing the campus process for submitting those statistics. Normally the date is around October 15th-ish, but I'm sure there's somebody on the line who can likely clarify based on the letter they've received from the department this year. So if you want to share that in the chat box, you certainly can, and we'll share that with the group. The other question that came in, one of the questions that I've seen, is in relation to new guidance or best practices around some of these new roles we're seeing designated as CSAs. We're actually going to be talking about that in just a moment, so I'm going to hold off on that question, but recognize that when we get to the slide in just a few slides, if you still feel as though the question isn't answered, please let me know and we'll revisit. And I'm having a lot of folks say that it's October 12th. Is the deadline for submission for this year for those crime statistics to the Department of Ed. So thank you so much for that. So the next question that we have is a common question that we receive is, what do we do if an incident occurred off campus but the institution responds on campus? So this could happen frequently, in which you are having cases that didn't occur within your own Clery geography, but certainly you are playing a role in terms of response. So say, for example, there was a private party that occurred off campus, but at that party there was an incident of domestic violence, or there was a sexual assault, or any of the Clery Act crimes that we're talking about. As Laura talked about earlier with that little equation, when we're looking at Clery Act crime statistics, it does have to be a Clery Act crime that occurred within Clery Act geography in order for it to be reflected in your statistics. So I think right there is one of the places where we might see some limitations in terms of the statistics, because we know that those boundaries are not always what's impacting whether or not someone within your community is hurt by someone else. But the other thing that I would say and reinforce is that even though you might have scenarios where you are not including that specific incident within your statistics because it did not occur within your Clery geography, that doesn't mean that you're limited in offering support and information, and there are parts of Clery Act requirements that actually require you to provide specific information and resources, written explanation of rights and options for sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, for example. I also wanted to reiterate, I know we talked a little bit about Title IX in the last slide because we wanted to address some of the questions that came in prior to this webinar. If you're somebody who's not as familiar with Title IX and really have even more questions now that we've kind of briefly addressed it within this webinar, remember that some of our sessions next week do focus more specifically on not just sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, but of the intersection between Clery and Title IX. So that's just something to consider. All right. So the next one is, will campus police investigate a report to substantiate a crime before it's reported or included in the statistics? So I know that Laura said one of the biggest takeaways that she thinks is important for her is really that equation of Clery crime plus Clery geography is what makes your Clery statistics. One of the biggest takeaways I hope that institutions will walk away with is that when we're considering our Clery Act statistics, we really are evaluating what Clery Act crimes were reported to us. It doesn't necessarily distinguish that a specific process occurred. So that district attorney might never move forward with that case. The victim within that case might never decide that they want to move forward with the criminal justice process. They might not move forward with a conduct process on the campus. But even though that's the case, as long as a Clery Act crime occurred within that Clery Act geography and was reported to a campus security authority, it is going to be reflected within your statistics. So we want to think about Clery in terms of crime reports, not necessarily findings of a judge, a jury, a prosecutor, or anything like that. The one thing, or the other thing, though, that we should note is that there is a means in which institutions might unfound a crime. So if there is a college or university that does have sworn or commissioned law enforcement as part of, and this is something that's established as part of the uniform crime reporting process and something that's been kind of adapted for Clery purposes as well, if there is an investigation and through that investigation, that sworn law enforcement makes a formal determination that that report is false or baseless. So that report, that incident did not occur, that there was no base for that particular report. That is the only time in which that incident would not be included in the statistics because it was unfounded. The Department of Education, within the final regulations for the most recent amendments to Clery, actually added a category in which institutions are expected to reflect unfounded crimes that occurred within their campus community within specific calendar years. Those unfounded crimes are not broken down by type of incident, or at least the institution is not required to break them down by type of incident, but at least gives the institution or members of the campus community a better perspective or understanding of how many of those crimes are unfounded. But in general, we want to remember that when we're thinking about Clery crimes and Clery reporting, it really is based on those reports, not necessarily the outcome. So the other question that we get a lot, especially at our trainings, is can you become a campus security authority even if you aren't required to be one? This one comes up a lot because I know a question that was coming in is, what about faculty? Are faculty considered to be campus security authorities? Typically, faculty are not considered to be CSAs under the Clery Act. Now, there could be an exception to that. So one of the categories that Laura mentioned earlier is that if somebody is designated as someone to whom individuals should report, that essentially makes them a campus security authority. So there are some institutions that choose to make faculty or consider faculty as campus security authorities. So it would certainly go back to some of your own campus specifics, but generally faculty would not fall within that category. And I think a lot of times when we're having that conversation, one of the things that we try to reinforce is that the Clery Act requires or tells you who is required to report. It doesn't limit who can report. So we certainly, I know so many of you are really working to create cultures of reporting in which people feel comfortable coming forward and sharing if something happens to them at your institution. There are also specific other policies related to Clery reporting that you include in your annual security report that also speak to this. So your policies for accurate and prompt reporting that really encourage bystanders to come forward if the victim of crime elects to report that an incident occurred, or if they're unable to make a report, so they're incapacitated, for example, and they're unable to report on their own behalf. That policy statement reflected in your annual security report really encourages members of the community to report if they know that something has happened. Your security awareness programs really speak to how can I be responsible for my own safety, but also the safety of others. So there are a number of different places in which you're encouraging really bystanders to be involved and to say and to do something if they know that something's happening within the campus community. However, when it comes to campus security authority and those requirements, that's really focused on who's required to report, not just on who may or is able to make a report. So So this is the area, like I mentioned, one of the questions that came in was in relation to, we know that in the most recent handbook for campus safety and security reporting, there were a number of different roles that were listed as campus security authorities that weren't previously included as specifically within that list. So one of those roles is the campus advocate. Another one, which was brought up in the questions pane, was the director of counseling. And so I'm going to address kind of this overarching question that we've been hearing from some folks in the field, and then I will certainly kind of dive into the director of counseling specifically. So the question is, I'm a campus advocate. How do I still fulfill my role of CSA while maintaining the survivor's trust? We know that different states have different requirements or different laws, I should say, in place in relation to the role of the victim advocate. So in some states, that victim advocate might have confidentiality. The Department of Education, although they are saying that advocates are CSAs, CSAs are not required to share personally identifiable information. So it's not perceived to be a conflict because the advocate is able to share non-identifiable information that certainly the institution is considering for the other steps that it needs to take. So it's including that information within its own campus crime statistics. It's using that for information to determine whether or not there's a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. But we also know that certainly a core part of being an advocate or being in a role where you are building and maintaining trust with students and other members of the community is wanting them to feel as though they can come forward and that you are a trusted resource. So it's a balance that certainly is important and that must be treated carefully. And there are a couple of different steps that institutions can take to really help address any of the concerns that you might have if you were the person in the role asking this question, or if you're a member of the community really wanting to understand how do advocates better fit in, or how can they fit in within the scope of campus security authorities. So one is to know what the requirements are. Because as we mentioned, Clery reporting is tied to Clery Act crimes that occur within Clery geography. So a lot of times information that might be coming into advocates or even to other roles on the campus isn't always necessarily going to fall under Clery reporting. So being as knowledgeable as possible as to what is required, what are the crime definitions that are used, what are the circumstances in which I'm required to report, is going to be important because that will limit oversharing. It will certainly make sure that the advocate is only sharing in situations in which they're required to. And then it will also make sure that there really continues to be a direct tie between the people who are implementing Clery and other aspects and those campus security authorities. So I would say that even though we're talking here specifically about advocates, knowing and understanding the requirements is important for all campus security authorities. Familiarize yourself with the institution's timely warning policy and be able to communicate about the institution's process. So one of the things that we've been hearing from advocates, or one of the concerns that we've heard from advocates in relation to their role as CSAs, is what does this mean in terms of the communication that's going out from the institution in timely warnings. So as we mentioned a little bit earlier, institutions might share warnings or are required to evaluate whether or not a timely warning is needed if there is a Clery Act crime within Clery geography. And if that specific incident does represent a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community, then a warning would be shared to help members of the community better protect themselves and to give them additional information in relation to their safety. And so one of the reasons understanding and knowing this particular process is useful is because that gives the advocate the information that they need to be able to answer any questions that a person might have about what information is being shared, why it's being shared, what they might expect. Timely warnings and any information that's publicly available related to these incidents should never identify a victim. And there's actually aspects of your sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking policy that are required to speak to that nature. But we also know that even though our policies talk about these areas very clearly, even though we communicate this in our annual security report, those one-on-one conversations are really going to inform how much or whether survivors feel supported within our community. So being able to know and understand the institution's timely warning process, to be a part of conversations as the institution is crafting or drafting timely warning templates to make sure that they are trauma-informed and and considering how bystander intervention can be factored in, and using the knowledge and the expertise that you have on the campus to really be a key part and a core part of that campus process is going to be important and useful. Setting expectations and gathering feedback. So if they have an understanding, if when working with the person, they have an understanding of who you might need to share non-identifiable information with and why that information is shared, that also creates a space for the advocate and for other CSAs certainly to talk about any concerns that they might have in that area. Are there pieces of information with what's required under Clery, the nature of the crime, the location of the crime, the date and time the crime occurred, or the date and time the crime was reported? Are there pieces of that that could potentially be identifiable, and what? So for example, if the incident occurred in that person's residence hall, that might be very different than if it occurred in a different location. The location in that instance could be identifiable. So it's an important part of the conversation. And last but not least, really communicating not only with the person who's coming forward and responding, but also with others on campus, making sure that you understand your role as the campus security authority, that you've had spaces to talk through any questions that you have in advance, and that you feel confident being able to communicate about that role with anyone who might be coming forward. Because we know that a lot of times if that position, if that individual has anxiety around or questions around their role or what the expectation is or what's going to happen with the information, that could unintentionally translate into how they're talking about it with the survivor. So it's certainly not a new challenge for many institutions. There are a lot of institutions that had advocates as CSAs prior to it more specifically being identified in the handbook, but it's also something that we really appreciate seeing so many of these conversations happening within the campus community so that we have the space and time to address them. In relation to the director of the counseling center then, because we know that some of the same questions or areas come up, one of the things that I will note, especially in relation to the question that came in earlier, is that that is not intended to be for situations in which if the director of the counseling center is also functioning as a counselor, that's not intended to include information that's shared with them during that interaction with the client. So if they are actually actively seeing individuals within the role of the counselor, anything that's shared with them in that capacity wouldn't be included. And I would point you to, we have a free webinar about the handbook highlights that we shared with the community right after the handbook, the updated handbook for campus safety and security reporting was released, that also included Jim Moore from the Department of Education, who heads up the Clery Act compliance team. And so I'd really encourage you to go back and to listen to some of his language around that for specification. But he did really specify within that particular webinar that it's only intended to include those reports that come to that director of counseling center within their administrative capacity. All right. The next one is, if a student at my institution tells us that they have a protection from abuse order in relation to an incident that took place outside of Clery geography, do we count the incident because it's reported within Clery geography? So this kind of connects back to one of our earlier questions, which is that it has to be an incident that occurs within Clery geography in order for it to be counted within your statistics. Now we're going to talk about some of the nuances around stalking. It changes a little bit when we're talking about stalking in particular, and we'll get to that in just a few slides. However, that doesn't mean necessarily that the institution isn't going to support or help enforce, for example, a protection from abuse order that is relevant to that individual's experience within the campus community. But in terms of the actual incident that led to the order being provided within that particular state, it would only be reflected within Clery statistics if the crime itself occurred within Clery Act geography. Your policy itself for sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking should speak to not only the orders that are available within your state, it should speak to orders that are available on your campus if you have no contact orders, and also the type of support that you can provide to a student or employee victim if they do have one of these orders in place. And then just a reminder before we move on to our chat box question, one of the things that we wanted to reinforce, because we're talking about a number of different areas, is that when you have questions specific to your own geography or how to count or capture your own geography, those questions, although we can always help and provide support as much as we can from a technical assistance lens and really help to connect you with the resources that we know are available, if you're trying to make some key determinations as to what fits within your own Clery geography and you need some more official feedback, we would direct you to the handbook for campus safety and security reporting, and beyond that, the help desk as well. For general TA guidance and understanding those concepts, and like we said, really helping you find information within the handbook, directing you to other places where we know we've received information from the Department of Education, then that would be something that we are poised and ready to help with. So moving on to Laura, who's going to lead us in a chat box question.
Thank you so much, Abby. So yeah, I know we're winding down to the last few minutes of our scheduled time with you, so we want to make sure that we get through these last few slides, but we did want to give you an opportunity to chat with us and let us know what types of crimes you are most unsure of categorizing at your institution. So feel free to include that in your chat box right now and send that on to us so we can get a general idea of where you all are coming from in terms of comfort with or discomfort with or uncertainty around categorizing certain crimes. Okay, I see a lot around stalking. That's perfect because we have a slide coming up right now about that. It looks like the VAWA crimes. Yep, dating violence, domestic violence, some alcohol and drug violations. Oh, one of them I can answer very quickly. It says sexual harassment, and that's a very quick answer, which is sexual harassment actually is not a Clery crime, so you don't have to worry about categorizing that one anymore. And great, okay, so yeah, it definitely seems like there's more around the VAWA crimes of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, and then a handful around drug and alcohol sense with the next few slides that we have coming up, which are really talking about some nuances around those crimes and what folks find themselves coming up against in terms of categorizing them and challenges with that. So Abby, I'm just going to ask if you could forward for me so I don't hold up our process anymore. That would be great. Thank you so much. So a question that came up, and this is a little bit of a result of slightly confusing language in the updated handbook, but we were able to ascertain some certain information from Jim Moore from the Department of Education, both webinars that we conducted earlier this summer. One of those, the one from July 7th, is available on our website, as Abby's already mentioned. But this is speaking to, so I live in a state that counts two people living together as roommates under domestic violence laws, so should I include roommates within our domestic violence statistics? And so the law was not written to intend to include roommates. However, you can as an institution determine that you would want to include roommates as the final part of the domestic violence definition allows for any other relationship that is covered under your state's laws around domestic or family violence. So the two strategies we offer to you are consistently include, if you are a state that is including roommates as a relationship that would be covered under domestic violence, or consistently exclude, referencing the department's language in both the preamble and the handbook as updated as of June 2016. You just want to, as with any of these types of decisions, be consistent in your application of that decision and make sure you are documenting the decision making. So why have you come to that, and are you consistently applying that and documenting your consistent application of that reasoning? Abby, I'm going to ask, oh wait, maybe it worked. Okay, thank you so much. So when we were talking about stalking, so we get this question often, since stalking involves a course of conduct, do we include every incident reported to us within our statistics? So you are only recording at the first location within the institution's Clery Act geography in which either the perpetrator first began the conduct or the victim first became aware of the conduct. So wherever it occurred first, either from the perpetrator enacting it or the victim being aware of it, that is where you start to count and record the course of conduct incidences. And so you don't need to include every single incident that takes place after you've established a course of conduct. However, if the course of conduct occurs over multiple years, you can include it again over multiple years. But a question we do get frequently around stalking as well is, if there are multiple victims, do we count multiple stalking incidents? And as we spoke to a little bit earlier in the webinar, if they are crimes against persons, you are counting per person. So if there are multiple victims that have each experienced this course of conduct, then yes, you would be counting multiple stalking incidents. Again, as long as these are crimes that Abby has mentioned are reported, that have occurred within Clery geography. And great, we're just going to move on to the next slide, which is talking a little bit more about hate crimes. I'm going to try to advance, if you would not mind advancing as well, just because my computer seems to have a slight delay. Okay, it looks like we are there. Great. So yes, if a hate crime has multiple bias elements, meaning if there is an incident that takes place that seems to be impacted by the perpetrator having a bias in one or more of the bias categories, are you counting the hate crime twice or however many times, or do you simply list out all the biases that were involved in that specific crime? And so the answer is a simple black and white answer. You do just include all of the categories of bias for each hate crime. So if there was a larceny theft that took place that was motivated by a racial bias and a gender bias, you would not list larceny race, larceny gender. You would list larceny that was motivated by biases in both the race category and the gender bias category. And so that was the language as to how you would categorize that is reflected on this slide. And just a quick reminder in terms of capturing this information in your ASR, hate crimes can be presented in both a narrative and table format. I feel like the table format, this is a personal choice, is just more helpful when it comes to making sure that you are accounting for all of your hate crimes in all of your Clery geography, but you certainly can represent that information in narrative format as well.
We also think it's useful, if you do have it as a narrative format, to have an introduction that really clarifies what you're reporting for, so that if you are, for example, indicating that no hate crimes occurred in a specific year, that your institution or your campus community at least has context for what you were evaluating to determine for hate crimes, because they do have to be connected to those underlying crimes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you for adding that, Abby. That makes a lot of sense. And I would even, I think what you're getting at too is say no crimes for this year in any of these Clery geography categories for any of these crimes related to any of these bias categories. You really want to make sure that your audience understands what you are talking about. And then in the interest of time, just wanting to move through these last few questions. So how do we classify marijuana if it was decriminalized within our state? And this was very clearly stated in the updated handbook. If it is decriminalized, it's no longer a criminal offense. Therefore, if you would not count that under Clery, because you are only counting drug law violations that there are arrests for, or drug law violations that are referred for disciplinary action that are also criminal offenses. And so if it's decriminalized, it's not counted under Clery. So you are not counting for a violation of law, just policy. Abby, would you mind advancing again? That would be super helpful. Thank you so much. Another common question that we do get is, if a student is found not responsible during the conduct process, then do we remove that incident within our statistics? So this is just a friendly reminder that, Clery Act crimes or statistics are capturing reports. So not findings of a conduct process or a criminal process. You are capturing the amount of reports that are fitting the definitions of these crimes that occur within these areas of geography. So if a crime is unfounded, you would include that within the unfounded category, but a reminder that unfounding a crime is really making a determination that a crime was false, that there's evidence to show that a crime was false or baseless, and that determination has to be made by a local law enforcement agency. So just know that that would take a lot to make sure that you would be unfounding a crime, and you are not going to be removing the incident from your statistics based on the outcome of an incident. And then these are just a few reminders around referrals. So for referrals, you are only counting things as a referral if these three pieces are met, so that the official receiving the referral must initiate a disciplinary action, and that you are retaining a record of that action, and that the action could, doesn't have to, but it could result in a sanction. That is what is defined as a referral. And great, I'm going to switch it back over to Abby to talk about the hierarchy rule and to take us through the end of the webinar today. Thank you, Abby.
We're getting a lot of great questions coming in related to that, so we'll make sure that we tackle those. We're just going to get through these final slides for those of you that committed only to that first hour, and then that way we'll also dive into some of the questions that are coming in now after that point, for those of you who can stay on the line or would like to listen to the recording afterwards. So one of the things we just wanted to remind you all is that there is a hierarchy rule that comes into play when we're looking at that bucket labeled criminal offenses. And as Laura mentioned, even though other incidents are certainly crimes as well, criminal offenses is just that label that the Department of Education gives to the crimes that you see on this particular screen. And the reason that we wanted to talk about the hierarchy rule is that it is something that's pulled from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Uniform Crime Reporting and the rules that apply there. And what it says is that when more than one criminal offense was committed during a single incident, you only count the most serious offense. And what they mean by during a single incident means that it took place, those incidents occurred during the same time and place. So the time interval between those offenses and the distance between the locations were insignificant. And so what you would be using, or what you would be doing is, in terms of the level of seriousness, so to speak, for the order of the hierarchy, the top, the murder and non-negligent manslaughter, is considered to be the highest of the hierarchy, and then it goes on from there. So for example, a single incident during the same time and place, an example within the hierarchy rule, using some of the crimes that you see listed in front of you, is that if a rape and a robbery occurred at the same time, only the rape would be included in the statistics because the rape falls under that category as sexual assault and is higher in the hierarchy. One of the other reasons why it's important to consider this is there are quite a few exceptions to the hierarchy rule. So for example, arson is always an exception. You always count arson regardless of the nature of the other offenses committed during that time, although certainly the hierarchy may come into play if there were multiple offenses committed during the same distinct operation as the arson, then you would report the most serious offense along with that particular arson. For sexual assault, if rape, fondling, incest, or statutory rape occur in the same incident as a murder, which would have been the only category that could have potentially been higher than that category in the hierarchy, you are going to count both the sexual assault and the murder. So again, if a sexual assault and a homicide occur at the same time, both are counted in the statistics. And fondling is recognized as an element of the other sexual assaults. So you'd only include a sexual assault as a fondling only if it is the only sexual assault that occurred within that particular incident. Hate crimes are also an exception to the rule, so you're going to be including for hate crimes, as Laura mentioned, all of those incidents that were bias motivated. And then dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking also fall outside of that hierarchy. So if you have an incident from one of the other categories, say, for example, you had an aggravated assault that was also domestic violence, you'd be counting it in both categories. And so here's those kind of quick reminders that we mentioned a little bit earlier for the major takeaways. Remember that statistics are always tied to your Clery Act geography, though we want to consider the hierarchy rule and when it would apply. There are a number of great resources, the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, a number of different webinars and handbooks and guidebooks that can really help you understand this even better. Remember to use the Clery Act crime definitions. They come from a number of different sources: Uniform Crime Reporting, the Violence Against Women Act for the most recent amendments to Clery. So you want to make sure that as we're analyzing specific incidents on the campus that we are using Clery-specific definitions and that we're classifying according to the requirements. And you see some breakdown there. So again, our goal here isn't to spend all of our time diving into that, but we did want to kind of give you a moment for some of the quick cheat sheets, so to speak, around those collecting statistics. And then one of the questions that came in a little bit earlier was aligned with this. How do I correct statistics within my annual security report? Do I need to resubmit them to the Department of Education? Do I need to notify my community if and when that happens? So the handbook provided some specific context for that. And they did say that if you need to correct your statistics within your annual security report, if you do notice that there needs to be a change to your stats, they say in the handbook to correct the statistics in all previous annual security reports that included those statistics. You'd want to make sure that you add a note that explains the change. So why do I see a different number now than we saw before, the date that the change was made, and here's the reason for the change. So add that caveat. And then they tell you to redistribute that annual security report using the same means that you did the previous time to make sure that your campus community has access. They also note frequently throughout the handbook that you can contact WESTAT. So since WESTAT is the federal contractor to whom you're submitting the statistics, if you need to make changes, you can reach out to them to talk about the options for making those changes in terms of what the Department of Education has within their records. If there are no reports for specific crimes, can we exclude them from our table? So one of the things we'd like you to remember is that 0 is a statistic. So sometimes we'll look at annual security reports. We do ASR reviews with our collaborative members. And one of the things that we might see is that there's a space in the table where there is no number, and sometimes that's a result of that there were no incidents that occurred for that particular crime. But when it comes to reflecting this information within your annual security report, 0 is a statistic. So just make sure that you are reflecting the information, even if the information is that no crimes occurred. All of the Clery Act crime statistics do need to be in a tabular format, except hate crimes and unfounded crimes can be in a narrative. And for our last category, the last question that we had, and then we'll move on to some of the questions from all of you. If an incident occurred 2 years ago but was only reported to the campus now, do I include it within my 2016 statistics or my 2014 statistics? So Clery Act statistics reflect the year in which the crime was reported, not in which the crime was occurred. So for the example here, if an incident was reported in 2016 that occurred in 2014, you're still reflecting it in the year that the crime was reported, and therefore it's going to be captured within your Clery Act crime statistics. So we do have a final chat box question of what tools or tactics do you implement right now to ensure accurate recording of statistics at your institution. My colleagues also plugging in the evaluation for today's webinar. Like we said, we're going to stay on the line and go through as many of these questions as we can that you've submitted throughout the session in case there are still some lingering questions. But please do, if you need to jump off the line, please do take some time to give some feedback as to your thoughts about this question and answer type format. Is it able or is it responding to some of the questions that you have on your own campus, and what did you like, or what are some suggestions that you might have for the future? So as we look at the chat box question, what tools or tactics do you implement right now to ensure accurate statistics at your institution? If you can take some time and plug in your answer into the chat box. All right, so we have a number of different people that are using reporting forms. And we also had some feedback in terms of training. So I think that's one of the things we talked about it a little bit earlier, but that campus security authorities are really a critical part of the inner working or the inner web of your institution, because they are the way, they're the means in which we're getting this information. And so training individuals, a lot of you were talking about the type incident reports that we have, annual staff training, the time that we take or the energy that we take in making sure CSAs know and understand their role can only benefit us in terms of making sure that we are having accurate reporting. And we do have a number of different resources on the National Campus Safety Awareness Month website. One of those resources is a set of free slides if you're putting together campus security authority training and trying to figure out what that might look like for your campus. We have a number of other resources through the Clery Center that might be useful to that, but we just want to remind you that that NACSAM website does have a number of free materials that you might use as you're really trying to make these determinations and figure out the best fit for training and notifying your own campus. Okay, great. So now we're at the very end of our webinar, so we just are going to go back and address some of the questions that we were seeing coming in a little bit earlier. There were a couple of folks who asked the same question, which was, when we're talking about referrals, if it was a violation of policy and we make a referral, but it was not a violation of law, do we include it in our statistics? So I'll reinforce what Laura mentioned earlier, which is when we're looking at referral for drug law violations, liquor law violations, and weapons offense law violation in order to be included in your Clery statistics. So even though your policy might be broader, and probably the easiest example is many of you might be at institutions that have a dry campus. If there's a policy violation where there's someone over the age of 21 who's drinking on your campus and you have a dry campus, that would not be a referral for the purposes of Clery reporting, because even though it's a violation of your campus policy, it's not a violation of law. Some of the other questions that were coming in, so just to reinforce one of the things that Laura mentioned on the stalking slide, is that not every incident has to occur within your Clery geography in order for it to be included as stalking. So say, for example, there is a stalking course conduct in which 2 incidents took place off campus, and then the person, student, the employee comes to the campus to report to you that this behavior is occurring, and there was at least 1 incident that was occurring within your Clery geography. That is what you would reflect for the purpose of stalking. So the course of conduct, all the different elements or all of the different incidents that occurred do not all have to take place within your Clery geography. And just a reminder that when we are talking about Clery crimes in general, we're talking about crimes that occurred within Clery geography. That doesn't mean that the person was a member of your own campus community. So the person doesn't have to be a student or an employee reporting in order for it to be reflected in your statistics, as long as it was a Clery Act crime that occurred within your Clery geography. And Laura, I don't know if you have anything that you'd want to add or expand to that.
No, I don't think so. There was another question that was pretty specific around stalking, so I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that one. But I think I would kind of refer back to what Abby said earlier around when there's questions around specific guidance as to whether or not to classify an incident as a crime, or whether or not you want to classify a certain part of geography as within your Clery geography. We would always recommend reaching out to WSTAT for that information. And for that type of an answer, as we're just not in a position to provide formal guidance on how to classify a specific incident. But I would not add anything else onto what you said, Abby, about the general guidelines around categorizing incidents as stalking.
Sure. And I think maybe the question that you're referring to, I'm scrolling up a little bit, is what if the perpetrator is, for stalking, what if the perpetrator is texting a victim's friend or employer, but that person is not substantially distressed, but the victim is this 1 or 2 stalking incidents? So again, we're always going to have to go back to that core definitions. And we know that stalking is defined as engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So if the person receiving the specific behavior is not experiencing that substantial emotional distress, they would not be, you wouldn't categorize that particular incident as stalking. However, there can be a number of different incidents where there is more than one victim. So say, for example, there is a ex-boyfriend who is targeting or directing stalking behaviors towards both the ex-girlfriend as well as the new boyfriend. If the current boyfriend is fearing for the safety of their partner, that person would fall as a victim of stalking, as would the girlfriend if both of them are experiencing the behavior. So it will really go back to, in terms of what's happening within that pattern or within that course of conduct, who is the behavior directed towards, and do they meet those elements? Is it causing a reasonable person to fear for their own safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress? And as Laura said, certainly we always encourage you to reach out to WSTAT. We can help you kind of talk through what the requirements are, what we know of the definitions, but we recommend that, especially if you're navigating specific cases on your campus, to go to your own experts within your campus community, or also reach out to us separately. We can help you as much as we can, or direct you elsewhere if needed. Another question that came in is, what about attempted crimes? For example, an attempted murder on campus would be a very serious incident. I absolutely agree with you. So typically, attempted crimes would be included if they met the Clery definition. However, the example that you gave, an attempted murder, is a little bit different. It's the one where it wouldn't, and only because it would be reflected in the aggravated assault category. So in that situation, in that scenario, it would be reflected in your statistics, but for that circumstance, it would be reflected as an aggravated assault. All right, we're just scrolling just to make sure that there are not any questions that we missed. So a lot of the questions that we saw coming in were really around that referrals question of, if it's not a violation of law, are we reporting it under Clery? So hopefully that specification or that clarification helped. It has to be a law violation for arrests and referrals in order for it to be a Clery reportable incident.
Abby, I just see one that might be helpful to answer for the group. There was a question on if there are multiple VAWA offenses, do you count each? So I know that what might come up for that is if we're really just strictly talking VAWA offenses, which is dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, there is guidance around how an incident that might fit all of the pieces for dating violence, you would not necessarily count as domestic violence because it would be separately distinctively dating violence as opposed to domestic violence. Then I know that, I don't know if you would want to speak to more on that, Abby, how the converse would then not be true. So just because it's domestic violence, you would not need to count it as dating violence as well, correct?
Yeah, so I'll try to drill that down. So if the incident meets the rise to the level of domestic violence, you wouldn't then include it as dating violence or vice versa. So you'd really want to look at those definitions. Which does it fall under? And if you've categorized it as domestic violence, you wouldn't then also include it within your dating violence category. However, you can have an incident that could be, for example, domestic violence and stalking, depending on what the scenario is. So when we're looking at those VAWA offenses, and I think we talked about that, there isn't a hierarchy rule that applies to that, but certainly the caveat of an incident that is domestic violence wouldn't be dating violence is going to be relevant there.
Great, thanks for that, Abby.
Another question I see is how critical is it to categorize type of bias in reporting hate crimes? I've inherited one incident of intimidation from 2013 and no one recorded which bias. So that is something where when we're talking about hate crimes, the reason that we're categorizing them as hate crimes within our statistics is because a Clery Act crime or one of those additional areas of larceny, theft, intimidation, destruction, damage, vandalism of property, or simple assault occurred that was motivated by bias. So the element of what crime occurred as well as the type of bias is going to be relevant. So I'd certainly encourage you to go back to others on campus. I know that you used the word inherited, so it seems as though you were not on the campus at that time, to try to reach out and see if, even if it's not in the records that you currently have or recorded via the means that you currently have, is there any other space or place on the campus where someone may have documented what that incident was or why it was recorded in that way. So I certainly would go back because it is going to be relevant what that underlying crime was. Okay. The other one is, another one I see is how should institutions document Clery crimes reported from a CSA? For example, Title IX received a direct report of sexual assault and makes the Clery coordinator aware of the report. How should the Clery coordinator document that report? So a lot of times it's really going to depend on what type of systems are being used for your particular campus. So was there a particular reporting form that individual used to report it to the Title IX coordinator? What is the method that the Title IX coordinator documents the reports that comes into them? So unfortunately, that is going to be more of a campus-specific type questions, but I think the question behind it is really important to consider, to think about when we are receiving reports, what is the method or what is the means of documentation that we're using? If it's, certainly not, or if it's outside of just Campus Security Authority reporting forms. So it's a question that I would certainly take back to your campus, talk to your Title IX coordinator about what their process is or what their documentation process looks like, and establish a method or a means within your institution of where you are classifying those particular, or recording, I should say, those particular incidents. Okay, trying to see, because we're just scrolling through, because I know a couple of these came in throughout the webinar. I'm just trying to make sure that there are no more that we missed. Laura, do you see any that we haven't been able to address thus far?
I just see one more from the very beginning that was a question around arrests, and it says, the handbook says that a civil citation is issued, which is in quotes, is not considered an arrest. Our jurisdiction uses, quote, municipal summons. The, quote, ticket is issued, but the person is not detained. Is this an arrest? And so I would go back to what the handbook does say, which is that if you are considering that municipal summons or ticket to not be an arrest, or to be a civil citation rather, then you would not consider that an arrest. I think the element of detention is not necessarily what they're looking for. It's more around the idea of what is documented within the police department, but I don't know, or with the campus safety or police department agency. But Abby, would you speak more to that, or would you add anything to that?
Well, I would just say, and I think this person also noted that the handbook does speak to these distinctions. Page 343 of the handbook addresses what's classified or what's considered to be an arrest. But that said, I think what we see coming up on campuses frequently is that there's kind of the same scenario or the same question that comes up over and over. So if you know that this is kind of a frequent question at your institution, reaching out to WSTAT, reaching out to get specific formal guidance on how that applies within your specific state is going to be useful, because ultimately, and this kind of goes back to our theme or our approach to Clery in general, is that we want to be kind of addressing these questions or asking these questions before we have an incident in which we need to apply them. So I think a lot of the questions that are coming up here, it seems like as we've been going through, you've been asking some really great questions specific to your own community as to how do we do this, or where does this information live, or some of those questions. So I'd really encourage you to continue to do that. And maybe take away or write down some of the action items or questions that were specific to your own institution, and figure out, do we have a consistent process for how we are determining, in this case, for example, it's the municipal summons, but I think that the concept can apply to other areas as well. Even if I might know the answer, or if I might make a certain distinction, is that how we're applying it across the board, and is there consistency? So I think as I go through, and one of the participants made a really great point about whether or not the person is summoned to court. So really going back, there's certainly a number of different state laws that come into play as to certain terms and what they mean for you. But really going back to asking ourselves some of those core questions as to, would it fit any part of that definition? So that first section about classify as arrest is really going to kind of be key as you revisit 343 to figure out whether or not that would fit within your own requirement.
Yeah, Abby, I would even add on to that, because this is one that I know I come back to again and again with questions. So please know, if you are still on the webinar, you're not alone if you have these questions. But on 343, the first bullet under that classify as arrest specifies that an arrest has occurred. So this is under Clery now. An arrest has occurred when a law enforcement officer detains an adult with the intention of seeking charges against the individual for a specific offense, and a record is made of the detention. So I would defer to that answer, and I would also defer to exactly what Abby said around, because language can be so difficult, distinct and different between states, always go to WSTAT if you are unsure of if a certain action is considered an arrest or not.
And one of the questions that came in, any idea why they use young person instead of just person? Probably more just stemming from, a lot of the scenarios that you might be navigating on your campus certainly might be with young people, or what we consider to be young people. But the distinction doesn't matter. So it brings us back to our broader question of, if there's an arrest that takes place within the campus community, and this is a Clery Act crime, that fits one of those categories, it's still reflected. So remember that for all of our Clery crimes, the person doesn't have to be a member of your community in order for the incident to be counted. And I think that kind of brings us back to what Laura said is her greatest contribution to NACSAM, although I would argue that there's a lot more contributions than just that one, that it doesn't need to be a Clery Act crime within Clery geography in order to make its way into our statistics. All right. Well, it looks like we got through all of the questions for today, but I know there are hundreds of you on the webinar, and many of you stuck it out with us to the end, so we appreciate that. Thank you again for joining us today. In your control panel, you'll see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you take a few short minutes to share your thoughts and feedback. We'd love to know what kind of content you'd like to see more of as we plan additional webinars throughout the year. As a reminder, this webinar was just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and the recording will be included in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast. I know that was a question that some of you had. In order to get that recording, we are including it within the National Campus Safety Awareness Month email and on the NACSAM website. So if you're not signed up for those emails, you wouldn't have access to the recording in that way, although it will be posted on our YouTube page as well. You can click on the links in the control panel to register for upcoming webinars and sign up to receive weekly professional development emails during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. And we'd encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle for daily campus safety information. You can visit our website to learn more information about other training opportunities and learning resources. Our Clery Center Collaborative Program is an example of one, which, as I mentioned, is a team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. If you do have any questions, or if there are any questions that we missed in scrolling through our list today, please do feel free to reach out to us using the email address info@clerycenter.org. And thank you again for joining all of us today, and we hope you have a great afternoon.